Della Hartwell carried the seventh hive box out to the edge of the cantaloupe field at first light and set it down in the dirt where every man in Caldwell County had told her nothing good would grow. She did not set it at the corner where it would be out of the way. She set it dead in the middle of the rows between the young melon vines where the morning sun would hit the entrance first. And then she pried the lid and watched the bees pour out into the cool air like smoke running backward into the sky. It was the third week of May, 1978, and the dew still sat heavy on the bottom land along the Sutter Creek Road. The men were already at the fence. They came down most mornings now, 3 or 4 of them, leaning on the top rail of the barbed wire with their coffee in tin cups, because watching the Hartwell woman put bugs in her melons had become the best free show in the valley. Roy Spangler's voice came across first. It always did. "There she is," he called. "Bee woman of Sutter Creek. You gonna milk them today, Della, or just let them rob you blind?" Della did not turn around. She crouched at the hive entrance with her bare hands and her sleeves rolled, no veil, no gloves, and she watched the bees find the first open melon blossoms down the row. A honeybee does not eat a cantaloupe. A honeybee crawls into the bloom and carries the pollen from the male flower to the female on the hair of its own legs. And without that crossing, the blossom drops off the vine and rots in the dirt, and you get nothing. No fruit. Bare runners and broad leaves and a field full of flowers that came to nothing. Her father had known that. The men at the fence did not know it at all, and that was the whole distance between them and her, though not one of them could see it yet. "You want some real help?" Roy called again. "I got a sprayer says he can dust this whole bottom in a morning. Kill every pest you got." The men laughed the easy way men laugh when they have decided a thing is foolish and mean to keep it foolish. "Bees are not a pest, Roy," she said, still not turning. "They are the only reason you ever ate a melon in your life." That stopped the laughing for half a breath. Then it started again, because they did not believe her, and a thing you do not believe cannot wound you. Roy Spangler farmed the 400 acres that ran right up against her fence line, and Roy believed in chemistry. He believed in the airplane that came over in June trailing its white fan of poison, and he believed in the barrels stacked in his shed, and he believed that a field was a thing you forced. Della believed a field was a thing you fed. Those two beliefs were about to meet that summer in the worst way, and the only one alive who already knew how it would end was a man 11 years in his grave, who had written every word of it down in a book. The book sat on the kitchen table back at the house where she had left it that morning. It was a leather apiary journal, brown gone near black along the spine, the cover soft as a worn glove from 40 years of being opened. Across the front, her father had pressed his name in hard pencil, Asa Hartwell, his account of the bees and the melons, 1931. Inside were the bloom dates and the hive weights and the notes on which corner of which field set fruit and which set nothing, all in his cramped, square hand, and on the last page he ever wrote, 3 months before the stroke took his speech, the line she had read so many times the pencil had nearly worn through. "Feed the bloom and the bloom feeds you, poison the bee and you starve the year." She was 59 years old. She had buried her father, and before him her mother, and she worked the place alone now, with no man to ask and no man to answer. And she had put in only 3½ acres of melons that spring, a small mocked patch against Roy's wide bottom, and she had decided some years back that she would rather be right and laughed at than wrong and pitied. The men at the fence took her quiet for slowness. It was not slowness. It was a woman counting. Now, the boy saw it before any of the grown men did. Roy Spangler had a hired hand that spring, a lean, quiet kid named Tobias Reyes, maybe 17, who came along to fix fence and mostly stood watching the bees with his mouth a little open. The third morning at the rail, while the men were laughing, Tobias did not laugh. He had been raised by a grandmother in the Rio Grande Valley who kept a few hives behind a house, and he knew what he was looking at. He watched Della's melon blossoms, and then he looked down the slope at Roy's big sprayed field where the blooms hung pretty and yellow and untouched, and a small frown came into his face, and he did not say a word. But he had counted too. On Roy's 400 acres the blooms opened and the blooms fell, and almost none of them swelled. He just did not have the words yet for why. By the end of May, the fence rail talk had a name for her that stuck: the Bug Farmer. It traveled to the cafe in town and into the feed store and out to the church lot on Sundays. Said, with a grin, said the way you say a thing about a woman who has lost her grip. The Bug Farmer's out there talking to her bees again. They did not know that talking to bees was a real old practice, that her father had done it, that you tell the hive the news of the house so the bees do not take offense and leave. They thought it was a widow gone soft in the head. They were wrong about nearly everything, and they were loudest about the things they were most wrong about. Here is the thing I want you to hold on to, because the men leaning on that fence could not, and it cost them the whole valley before the summer was out. Della Hartwell was not eccentric. She was early. Every strange thing she did that spring was a thing her father had proven on this exact ground 2 generations back, written down with dates and weights and the patient cruelty of a man who had watched a field fail and refused to lie to himself about why. The county thought they were watching a woman lose her mind. They were watching a woman remember, and what she remembered was about to be the only thing standing between 4 counties and a year with nothing in the barn. So keep one question in your mind as we go, because everything turns on it. If a poison kills the thing that is eating your crop, and it also kills the only thing that lets your crop become a crop at all, then which one was the pest? The men at the fence never asked it. Della had answered it before she could walk. Asa Hartwell had not started with bees. He had started, the way most men in Caldwell County started, with a barrel and a hose. The summer Della was 8 years old, 1927. Her father had sprayed his cantaloupes against the cucumber beetle the way the extension man told him to, and he had killed the beetle. And he had also killed every bee within reach of the bottom land, his own and the wild ones in the creek bank both. And that fall he brought in 1/3 of the melons he had brought the year before, and he could not understand it, because he had done everything right. He had killed the pest. The field still failed. It was Della's mother, Inez, who had set the journal page in front of him. Inez Hartwell had grown up on the Mexican side of the river before she crossed it to marry a melon farmer, and her own people had kept bees in clay pots for the squash and the beans since before anybody wrote anything down, and she told Asa, plain, at the kitchen table, you killed the wedding to spite the moth. A melon flower has to be married. The bee is the only preacher you've got. Asa Hartwell was a hard man, but he was not a stupid one, and a man who has just watched 2/3 of his crop rot on the vine will listen to almost anybody. He stopped spraying the bottom land. He bought 2 hives. The next year the melons came in so heavy the wagon axle cracked on the section road, and from that day to the day he died, Asa Hartwell kept bees in his melons and wrote down every bloom, and the men in the county laughed at him too, just quieter, because he was a man and you laughed at a man behind his back. If you have learned anything by 60 acres of your own failure, Asa wrote in the journal the winter Della turned 12, learn this: the county will mock the thing that saves it. They mocked me. They will mock you. Let them. The melon does not care who is right. Della had read that line so many times she said it in her sleep, but she had not learned the bees from the page. She had learned them from his hands, the spring she was 9, the year after the wagon axle cracked. He had taken her out to the first 2 hives at the head of the field before sunup, and he had made her put her bare hands flat against the front of the box, and she had been afraid. And he had said, "Lo, do not be afraid. They read fear the way a dog reads it. Off your skin. Be still." She had gone still. And the warmth of 40,000 bees had come up through the wood into her small palms like the side of a sleeping animal, and the hum had come up her arms and into her teeth, and she had stopped being afraid, all at once and forever. A bee will not sting a still hand, her father had said. It is only the slapping hand it stings. Most men go through life slapping. He had said it about bees. She understood, by the time she was grown, that he had not only been talking about bees. That is the kind of story this channel was made to tell. There is a woman like Della Hartwell in every county in this country. Women who held the hard ground together with knowledge nobody else would carry and got laughed at for the trouble, and we are working through their stories one harvest at a time. If you would rather hear the truth of how this land was really kept than the version where the loudest man was right, you are among your own people here. So stay with me, because we are only at the planting and the year has not yet turned. She had grown up in those hives, and the work of them was a craft the county never bothered to learn because it could not see the use of it. There was a way to it, a whole patient discipline, and Della ran it the way her father had written it. She set the hives in the middle of the field and not the corner, because a bee works in a widening circle out from its own door, and you want that door at the heart of what you need married, not off at the edge wasting half the circle on the section road. She set the entrances to the east so the first sun would warm the board and put the bees to work an hour earlier than a north-facing box. An hour that across a whole season was the difference between a set field and a thin one. She did not crowd them. Her father's page said 2 hives to the acre on melons and no more, because bees flown from too many boxes will rob the near blooms and starve the far ones, and Della had counted it out for her 3.5 acres and her 7 boxes, and known to the row how far her preachers could reach. She fed them sugar water in the cold weeks before the bloom, so the colony built up strong and ready the very day the first melon flower opened, instead of straggling up to strength a week too late the way a wild swarm does. None of it was magic. All of it was written down. And every line of it was a thing a man with a barrel of poison never had to think about. Because he had decided a field was an enemy to be beaten rather than a marriage to be kept. She could tell you, walking a row, which blossoms had been worked and which had not, and the men could not. A married melon bloom set a small green swelling behind the flower inside 2 days, no bigger than a pea, and Della would pinch a faded blossom and show you the swell starting, the fruit taking hold. And then she would walk you 30 feet down the slope toward Roy's line where the same blossoms faded and left nothing behind them but a dry stem. The difference was the whole story if you had eyes for it. The men had eyes for the green of the leaf and the yellow of the flower, which any field can fake right up until the day the truth comes out from under the leaves. A melon field will lie to you for a month. Then it tells you everything at once. So when Roy Spangler stood at her fence in May of 1978 and offered to dust her bottomland for free, she did not argue with him. Arguing was for people who had not already seen the end of the story. She just kept setting hives. If you have made it this far into Della Hartwell's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She set the last 2 hives at the head of the field on the 1st of June, which made 7 in all, and by then she could read the bottom land like her father had taught her to read it, by sound. A field that is setting fruit hums. Walk into a melon field full of working bees at 9 in the morning when the blossoms are open and the whole bottom is a low, steady note, like a hymn held under the breath, and you know without lifting a single leaf that the crop is married and the year is made. Della walked her rows every morning and listened for that note, and it was there, strong, and down the slope at Roy Spangler's fence line there was nothing. Pretty yellow blooms and dead air. His field looked finer than hers from the road. His field was a graveyard with good manners. It was not all certainty for her either, and I will not pretend it was, because the part of this that the men never saw was the night she nearly lost her nerve. The 2nd week of June, a hard wind came up out of the southwest ahead of the Boer year, and it carried the first of Roy's spraying onto her field margin before she had thought to close the hives, and she walked out at dawn and found the ground in front of her 2 front boxes carpeted with dead and dying bees, a hand-thick drift of them along the entrance board, twitching, their legs working at nothing. She knelt in the dirt among them. She picked one up and held it on her fingertip and watched it die. And the doubt came on her the way it comes on anyone alone with a thing their father swore by and the whole county swears against. She thought, that night at the kitchen table with the lamp low and the journal open, what if the men are right and I am the fool? What if I have boxed up the last living bees in 4 counties only to feed them to the airplane 1 box at a time? She did not sleep. But in the gray before light she read the page again, the one about closing the hives against the drift, the one her father had written after his own bad year, and she understood that he had stood exactly here, in exactly this doubt, and gone on. So she went out before sunup and sealed the 5 surviving boxes with wet burlap and screen and a prayer she did not say out loud, and she moved them by hand, in the dark, 200 feet upwind to the lee of the cottonwood row, and she lost not one more bee to the drift the whole rest of that summer. It was the hardest morning of the year, and nobody ever knew she had it. That is the part the vindication leaves out. The right thing very nearly looked like the foolish thing right up until the day it didn't. She knew why Roy's field was failing, and it grieved her more than it pleased her, because Della Hartwell had not a vindictive bone in her body, only a patient one. Roy had sprayed in April for the seedling maggot, and he had sprayed again the 2nd week of May for the beetle, and each time the airplane came over it, laid its poison right up to her fence and a little past, and each pass had thinned the wild bees out of the creek bank and out of the hedgerows for a half-mile in every direction, and the only bees left alive in the whole bottom were the ones Della kept boxed in her own field and walked among, with her bare hands. Roy's blooms had no preacher. They opened and waited and married nobody and fell off into the dirt, and Roy Spangler walked his green and flowering field and saw health, because he did not know how to read the silence. Tobias Reyes knew. The boy came to her gate on a Tuesday evening at the very end of the first week of June, alone, with his hat in his hands. And he stood there a long minute before he could get it out. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "Roy's melons aren't setting, not any of them. He's got a whole field of flowers and no fruit coming on, and he's fit to be tied, and he can't say why." He looked back over his shoulder toward the Spangler place. "My grandmother kept bees," he said. "I think I know why. But he won't hear it from me. I'm just the hand." Della looked at the boy a long while. Then she said, "Your grandmother was right, son, and you can come walk my field any morning you like, and you don't have to ask." But she did not tell him to go warn Roy. She had learned from her father that you cannot make a man hear a thing before the thing has cost him enough to listen. Roy Spangler had not yet paid the price of his certainty. The county had not paid it either. It was coming. It came in the third week of June, on a warm, wet wind out of the southwest, the way it had come in her father's worst year and his father's before that. The squash vine borer and the melon aphid both rose up out of the river bottom at once, thick, the kind of year-old men talk about, and every farmer in 4 counties did the only thing he knew to do. He sprayed. The airplanes flew from before dawn until the heat killed the lift, day after day, and the white fans of poison drifted across Caldwell and Sutter and 2 counties more, and the chemical settled into every hedgerow and creek bank and field margin from the river to the foothills. They killed the borer. They killed the aphid. And in killing them, they finished what the spring spraying had started, and they wiped the last living pollinator off 4 counties of melon ground in 9 days. Della did not spray. She walked her field in the morning with a wet bandana over her nose and mouth against the drift, and she watched her own bees, sealed and watered and fed, and she watched them work. Because a honeybee that has a box to come home to, and a keeper who knows to close the hive against the drift, will ride out a thing that kills every wild bee in the open. She lost 2 hives to the edge of the drift that week. She had 7. She closed the other 5 at dawn each day and opened them at dusk when the planes were down, and she walked the field with grief in her chest, not for herself, but for what she could see coming for everyone who had laughed. And the melon blossoms in 4 counties opened and waited for a preacher who was dead and married nobody and fell. You have to understand what that means on a melon farm, because it is not like a frost or a hail that comes and goes in an afternoon. There was no storm to point at. The field stood green and tall and flowering and beautiful straight through the end of June, and the men stood at their fences proud of the prettiest crop they had ever grown, and not one melon in 100 set behind the bloom. The flowers fell off clean. The vines ran and made nothing. By the second week of July, when the fruit should have been swelling to the size of a man's 2 fists, Caldwell County had melon fields stretching to the horizon with nothing under the leaves but bare dirt and dead blossoms, and the men finally walked out into the middle of their own rows and got down on their knees and lifted the leaves and saw it, and the silence that came over the valley then was a different silence than the one in the spring. In the spring the silence had been in the fields. Now it was in the men. Tobias was on the Spangler place the morning Roy found out, mending the gate 20 feet off, and it is worth telling exactly as it fell and not as a proud man would wish it had. Roy walked his prettiest 40 out by the road, proud, 2 of the cafe men along to admire it, and he reached down to heft what he expected to be a melon the size of a soup pot. And his hand closed on a dry runner, and bare dirt. He stood up. He walked 10 feet and lifted another leaf. Bare dirt. He walked the row faster. Then he was not walking. He was tearing the leaves back by the armful down the middle of his finest field. And the two men stood at the end of the row and did not follow him, and one of them, old Harlan Vesco, said, real quiet, "Roy, what is it?" And Roy Spangler stood in the middle of 40 acres of the healthiest barren field in Caldwell County and could not get an answer out, because he did not have one. Because the answer had been leaning on a fence laughing 2 months running, and her name was the Bug Farmer. "Where's the fruit?" Harlan said. "Roy, where is the fruit?" "I don't know," Roy said. He said it 3 times. I don't know. I sprayed her clean. There wasn't a bug left out here." And Tobias, who was mending the gate 20 feet off and had his grandmother's whole valley in his blood, almost said it then. Almost said, "That's the why. Roy, you sprayed her clean." But he had learned from watching Della that a man cannot hear the thing before he has paid for it. And Roy had not yet finished paying. So the boy kept his mouth shut and mended the gate and let the silence do the work that no words of his could have done. Roy Spangler lost 390 of his 400 acres. He had borrowed against the crop in February, the way a man does, $11,000 at the Caldwell Bank, and the crop did not exist. It had flowered, and it had failed, and there was nothing to sell, and the note came due in the fall the same as if the Melons had filled the wagons. And Della Hartwell's 3.5 acres set fruit so heavy that summer that the vines lay flat under the weight of them, melon after melon, sweet and full and netted gold, in the one melon patch in 4 counties where the preacher had been kept alive. The men did not come to the fence to laugh any more. For a while they did not come at all. A man cannot stand at a fence and mock a woman across a field that is bowing under fruit while his own field lies barren behind him. That is not mockery, that is confession, and no man volunteers for it. So they stayed away, and Della brought in her melons with 2 hired boys and her own 2 hands, and she did not say a word about it to anyone, because her father's voice was in her ear. The melon does not care who was right. It was Tobias who came first, the way the youngest and the least proud always come first. He came up the section road on foot one evening in late July while she was loading the wagon, and he stood at the open gate, not leaning on it, and he took off his hat. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I quit Roy." He took a breath. "I want to learn the bees. The proper way, the way your father did it, the way my grandmother tried to teach me before she passed. I'll work for nothing. I just want to know how to do it so I never have to stand in a dead field again and not know why." Della set down the melon she was holding. She looked at the boy a long time, and something moved in her weathered face that was not quite a smile. Because she did not smile for show, but was close kin to one. "Your wages are a hive of your own come spring," she said. "And the book, when I'm done with it, you'll read better out of it than these men ever could, because you came asking instead of laughing. Get up here and learn to close a hive against the drift, because you'll need that first, and you'll need it every year, because they are not going to stop spraying just because it cost them one summer. Men don't. The country forgets." The boy got up into the wagon, and that was the start of it. Roy Spangler came last, which was right, because his pride was the biggest, and the biggest pride is the slowest to bend. He came in the first week of August in his truck, and he did not get out at first. He sat at the end of her road and looked at her field, fruit to the horizon, and then he looked back at his own, and then he drove up slow, and got out with his hat already in his hand. He was not a young man, and the failure had aged him 10 years in a month. He stood at the gate where he had leaned to laugh, and the words came hard. "I owe the bank $11,000, he said, "and I have got nothing in the ground to pay it." He looked at her bees working the late blooms. "I called you the bug farmer, Della. I stood right here and called you that." "You did," she said. She did not soften it, and she did not sharpen it. She let it stand. "I killed my own crop," he said slowly, like a man tasting a thing he could not believe. "I sprayed it dead with my own hand, and I thought I was saving it. The plane took your wild bees, too. There wasn't a thing left out there to set the fruit." He was quiet a moment. "My granddad farmed this bottom. He never sprayed a thing. I thought he was just behind the times." "Your granddad," said Della, "kept bees. Most of them did. Before the chemical men came through with their barrels and their pamphlets and taught a whole county to poison the one thing it could not farm without. It is not a new thing I am doing, Roy. It is the old thing. You are the new thing, and the new thing failed." Roy Spangler stood there and took it, because there was nothing in it that was not true. And a true thing said plain is the only medicine for a man who has lied to himself. Then he asked the question that the youngest had asked first and the proudest asked last. "Will you teach me?" he said. "Next year. I'll keep bees. I'll quit the spray on the bottom, I swear it. Just tell me how to start." And Della Hartwell, who had been called crazy and soft and a bug farmer by this man across this fence for 2 springs running, did not gloat and did not turn him away, because her father had written the answer to this very moment 40 years before she ever needed it. The county will mock the thing that saves it. Teach it anyway. "Come in the spring," she said. "Bring the boy's grandmother's name if you can find it, the one in the valley. We will get you 2 hives. You will set them in the middle of the field, not the corner, and the men at the fence will laugh at you, and you will let them. Because the melon does not care who is right. It only cares who fed the bloom." Roy Spangler put his hat back on and drove home to a barren field and a banknote he could not pay. And he was a poorer man that August than he had ever been, and he was, for the first time in his life, beginning to be a wise one. The valley did not heal in a year. Half the men sold off and moved on, and the bank took what the failed crop could not cover. And the airplanes came back the next spring because men do forget, the way Della had told the boy they would. But on the little melon ground along the Sutter Creek Road, the bees worked every June, and there were 3 keepers now instead of 1, then 5, then a dozen scattered through the bottom, and the wild bees came back slow to the hedgerows where nobody sprayed. And the melon fields that kept their preachers set their fruit, and the ones that did not, did not. The Hartwell County Extension Office, which had spent 30 years telling men to spray the bottom land clean, sent out a young agronomist that next summer, a careful man named Powell Eddings out of the Land Grant College up north, who walked Della's field with a clipboard and counted the set fruit per 100 feet of row, and counted Roy Spangler's the year he started his hives, and counted the sprayed fields that had not changed, and he wrote it all up in a report that he did not put her name on, at her asking. "Call me Cooperator B," she told him. My father would not have wanted the fuss. The report went into a drawer in a government office and changed nothing for a long while, the way true things often wait. But the boy read it, and the boy kept it, and the boy is the reason you have likely eaten a melon grown the old way without ever knowing the name of the woman who refused to forget. Della Hartwell farmed the bottom land 22 more years. She kept the journal on the kitchen table where her father had kept it, and she added her own bloom dates and hive weights to the back pages in a hand that grew shakier each year but never less sure. And below her father's last line she wrote a line of her own. The autumn she turned 81, when her hands had gone too stiff to lift a hive box, and Tobias Reyes ran the bees for her on the land. She had deeded him. It was a clear, cold evening at the very end of the season, the sun going down red behind the foothills, the last of the melons in and the vines pulled, and the field gone quiet for the winter. Tobias had set the leather journal in her lap on the porch, the cover soft as a glove, and she ran her thumb along the worn spine the way her father had, and the way she had 10,000 mornings, and she opened it to the last page and read her father's line aloud one final time, slow, feed the bloom, and the bloom feeds you. Poison the bee, and you starve the year. Then she closed the book and looked out at the dark field where she could no longer hear the hum, but knew it was there, sleeping, waiting for May. Roy Spangler had been gone 3 years by then. He had not been humiliated in the end, and that mattered to her. He had simply gotten old keeping bees in a corner of the bottom land he managed to hold. A quiet keeper among other quiet keepers, his pride long since spent and something better grown up in its place, and when he passed the county, buried him as a melon man, which is what he had finally late become. The men who had leaned on the fence to laugh were scattered or under the ground, and the laughing was so far gone that the young farmers in the valley did not even know it had ever happened, that there had once been a county that called a woman crazy for keeping alive the one thing the county could not live without. Tobias asked her that last evening on the porch if she had ever wanted to tell them, to stand in her bowing field that first failed summer and call across the fence the way they had called across it at her. To say it plain, I told you all. You laughed and you starved. Della Hartwell shook her head slow and gave him the line she had written in the back of the book, which was the only answer she ever gave and the only one that was ever true. A field does not ask who tended it, she said. It only answers the hands that did. So, when you put your own hands to whatever ground is yours, here is the question I would leave with you, and it is the same one Della answered before she could walk, and the same 1/4 counties of proud men never thought to ask until the year it ruined them. When something is eating at the thing you have built, will you reach first for the poison that kills the pest and everything else along with it? Or will you do the slower, harder thing and ask, before you spray, what it is you cannot live without?